Actually, something that Natalie mentioned is really critical, but a number of others of you have got at this too. And the concept is really has to do with developing a path to identifying where you are in terms of issue definition and getting to results. Because remember, this is all about, again, this can be very, very complex, but it's pretty basic. What we want to do is get results in areas that you think are important. So let me just walk through one concept with you. As you're taking a look at it, at an issue, a lot of times you start moving to implementation. Before you've really gone through these other steps. And it's really important to consider this. I think we talked about this last time, but it really is very fundamental. And that is, before you begin to tackle a problem and get into implementation, before you begin to do some planning activities, and I saw this last time, there are a lot of plans out there. But there wasn't necessarily there isn't always an assessment phase. And by the assessment phase, that's a very preliminary step you take to define and identify, especially within the context of your, what I call strategic vision, mission. And I think John's writing it maybe mission, and then strategic initiatives. But before you put something on your priority list, before you start getting into implementation, before you start giving the staff direction, you want to really do an assessment. And that assessment should answer the following questions. What is successful? How does this help us achieve our mission or our vision? And also, what additional information do we need to have to really put together a good plan? All right, and for you to decide that you want to get into the planning stage. So that assessment is really critical, because too often people spend a lot of time and staff time and resources planning for something when it really isn't a target, it really isn't a high priority, and you really haven't scanned whether there's other options of solving that problem. Because at the planning stage, you're really beginning to plan to implement something. The planning stage is really looking at what are the resources, what's the timeline that we're going to get this done. What's the implementation? What are we going to need to actually implement?
Where do you think we have done that? What would be some examples of not having done the assessment and jumped right into the planning phase?
Let me give you an example of where this often happens.
Okay.
All right. It can happen if you're preparing a downtown plan. I mean, I've seen that, and I see that actively happening in other communities. Before you begin to put together a downtown plan, you go through the assessment. What do we want to accomplish with our downtown? What's the goal of having that downtown refurbished? What does success look like? And how does that help us achieve our vision? Another example would be even, and I don't know that this happened here, and I'm not saying it did, but even at something like preparing a UDO, really understanding what do we want to achieve with that, all right? So you get into that planning phase before you really answer some fundamental questions. Why are we doing this? How does it fit into our overall vision? How does it help achieve it?
So I think an example of where we did do this is the hiring of you. I think we assessed the situation, we knew what was going on, or what was not going on, or where we were at, and then when we brought you on board, we communicated that to you, that that's what you were being, and I would hope, they asked a question about Dennis, that when you brought Dennis on board, you implemented that same tone to him, is you're going to come in and assess where we are in this and tell me what we need to do to move forward and go from there. You know, I hope that's what he told you, because.
That's what the last,
I got about 4 hours on the back half of it.
Right. So, and in any position that you bring on board
right.
in that relation, I think we're in the planning phase coming off the assessment on just about everything at this point. I don't think we really, I mean, again, back to the things that were immediate, I think we maybe implemented. I can't think of anything off the top that we did, but I think that there's a case for that when there's something that's immediate. We just need to implement something. It may not be the correct thing to implement, but at least to try to address it and move forward.
I'll give you a real good example. Kensington Drive.
Well,
No, I mean, think of the history.
right.
Wells Fargo spent $500,000 in that based upon being told by the town to do it. We didn't know even who owned it, and now we got it, and we're gonna spend another 2 point whatever million. We got to an implementation that hadn't really done the complete assessment, and I'm not being critical of the road, but the complete assessment and then the planning for it and all the way down, and then we had to come back and redo it.
And then I guess, but back to Fred's point, I'm not putting words in Fred's mouth about this, but then to me, it would be like the urgency of it then. You say we're in the implementation of it, or we actually tried to implement something at that point, and then we came back and we reassessed and planned some more, but we haven't done anything on it in the past year at this point, at least. I mean, not that, again, I'm.
Nothing visible.
Right.
Allow me a moment to defend Mike McLaurin. Okay. The Wells Fargo hired the same contractor that messed it up. They committed their $500,000, not Mike. Mike sat there on it. So I'll give him credit for that. But back to the main point, the hardest thing we do is assessing an issue. And I've never in my career started anything without having to go through a very rigorous assessment. And Kensington Drive had no rigorous assessment. Quite frankly, the comprehensive plan got started without a very rigorous assessment. And so did the UDO. Better, each one got better, but, you know, it's incumbent upon this group to do the rigorous assessment. And part of that is a cost-benefit analysis too. Who does this benefit? You know, those kind of things. And that's what we have to answer as a board. And planning, if you do the assessment properly, the planning will flow from it. You've answered the questions already. It's just a matter of putting, you know, spelling it out, drawing it, doing whatever. And then implementation should be a dream.
Well,
But we also-
go ahead, Paul.
We've also done assessment and planning and not have any knowledge of how we're gonna fund
Right.
implementation, like the 2012 thing.
Right.
They had the assessment, but they didn't think about the implementation part of what it was gonna cost. They did 1,000,000 plans over that, because of that. How many plans do we have in the books now? We have, what, 30? Okay,
Bookshelf.
but hardly any of them been implemented because we don't have the funds to implement them. So we need to decide in the assessment part, how are we going to be able to implement
Right.
while we assess? Because if we aren't going to be able to implement, why are we doing all this?
Right.
We're only going to do the job half done. It's like, I'm an old salesman. A salesman can have all this knowledge about the features and benefits and tell the customer, but if he doesn't ask for the damn sale, he won't get it.
I guess that's the only
Excuse my
thing,
French.
the only thing with the assessment to me is our level of assessment versus staff level of assessment. And the point that was brought up about the elm tree, the dogwood tree, the this tree, whatever tree it was, shouldn't be planted in a planting strip. I have no idea.
Right.
But I would depend on Dennis
Absolutely.
to sell whomever, hey, y'all been planting dogwoods or whatever trees in this strip you're not supposed to plant.
This is what hard answers that.
Okay, right.
Follow these steps, it answers that question.
Right.
And, yeah, and we're gonna need to make sure we revisit this, because this is one of the most fundamentals here. If I don't answer that before I leave here, don't pay my bill.
Well, just, and the thing to guard against is analysis paralysis, that
Right.
you just can't ever get to a decision because you just for whatever reason, don't think you have enough, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to, sometimes it's not a leap of faith, but there's always risk in any decision that you make.
And we'll need to talk about that too, Brenda.
When I look at this, in my mind, I'm thinking from an IT background, and you'll probably, you too, Steve, is when we were looking at the need, assess the need, and we pulled together, the first thing we did was pull together the subject matter experts. What's the need? What do we want it to be? And even what is the end result that we're going to do? And then going into the planning, implementation, and then testing, writing procedures, and then the rollout. And there's specific steps all the way down till you get to it. And that's kind of how I see this with my IT brain.
Yep.
And this is clearly more focused at the elected official level, and this is more at staff, but it isn't all elected or all staff here.
And I just, close to 2 years now, the hardest part as a board is getting to what information do we need to make a decision, forcing ourselves to go through that, not get down into the plan and the implementation, but what are the questions we need answered, back to your point, Natalie, so you can bring something forward to us that answers the question. That's hard.
It is, but again, it's very manageable. Ready, aim, fire, all right? And what happens too often is you kind of skip this altogether. Organizations can, and actually what it comes down to is ready, fire, aim. And that's what I call solutions in search of a problem. That there's a good idea out there, let's do it. But you need to assess, and Natalie said this earlier, we need to, one of the things you want to assess is now the time to do this, or there are other fundamental building blocks we need to have in place. And I say that because we're going to talk about systems. And Warren's talked about this as well. There's just some systems you need to get in place as you do this. So an example of that is pavement management systems, and I think we probably talked about it. If you don't have a pavement management system, I would really recommend that you wait to do almost any maintenance except emergency until you get that in place. Why? Because you're not assessing where your priorities are, where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. Once you get that, that's an assessment, then you can plan.
And we're doing that one. So, we're going away from squeaky wheel assessment to a real.
But I guess back to Fred's point though, this card I'm looking at now, it says the first step is the elected officials identify the issues. Well, again, I'm just flat out honest I can be. Again, I have no idea of some of the core issues that don't have process, that are not being addressed. That's what Warren has identified for us to bring forth. I mean, that, unless I'm just looking at it wrong.
No, you've got it. Let me just get into that. Let's move into that if that's okay. Right now, this, because you raise an important issue, and you have this. Do you have the full?
Yeah.
So, and this is admittedly a shortcut. This is still a shortcut on this discussion. So this is the most fundamental building block of all the systems that you're going to work with. And I'm going to walk through this somewhat quickly, but it'll still take a little bit of time. There are three basic steps. I mean, it's the stages. It's the process discussion, a policy discussion, and then actually decision discussion. And in that process, John is exactly right. The staff does need to bring to you issues that they think you need to address. But it's up to you to decide whether you want to tackle them. And you may also bring up issues. The only point in this is very basic, and that is you're in charge. You're in charge. You decide what issues as a board, as a body. And the mayor's job is to make sure that you're not using time, staff time or your time, even in meetings, unless there's an agreement, yeah, we should do this issue. Now, the last time I did this, the city attorney was, I thought he was going to throw something at me, but I said that the manager can bring you issues, including approving a budget or a contract, and they may say, they may tell you that if you don't do this, there's some legal implications. But you don't have to pass a budget if you don't want to. Now, it'll shut down the city eventually, it'll cause some significant problems. He needs to spell all those out. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to do anything that any staff tells you, but you have to understand the implications. And I emphasize that because at the end of the day, if you're not getting things done, it's your fault. And you need to understand that it's your responsibility. Their job is to provide clear, compelling, unvarnished information to you that would indicate, first of all, here's the issues we think you should be addressing. Including in this session today, they're going to give you that information. If you don't want to deal with all of them or any of them, up to you. Once you decide that, though, it's your agenda, because this is your community. They cannot, and that's the advice that most managers bristle at and most staffs when I give it to them. They can't make any of this stuff more important to them than it is to you, because you're in charge. You're elected. They're not elected for anything. You're elected because people trust your judgment. You got to make those calls. So they give you this an issue or a list of issues. Here's issues we think you should tackle. And they should also be providing some information that indicates why you should do that, with advantages and disadvantages. Advantages and disadvantages. Usually this isn't a real complex undertaking, and 90% of the issues you're going to talk about, you're not going to spend a lot of time discussing whether you should tackle them or not. But that, what did I say, success is in the margins? It's that last 10 to 20%. You got to start saying no to some issues. You got to start saying no to some issues. And it may be issues the staff brings up, it may be issues you bring up, it may be issues from the public. But this whole effort, and we've been using this for 20 years, was based upon work in a community pretty close to your size. Arden Hills, Minnesota, had over 2,000 acres of federal land that was being given to them. It was the Twin Cities Army Ammunition Plant. Severely contaminated, but great opportunity for redevelopment because the feds were going to help pay for the cleanup. But they had to come up with, the city had to come up with a plan to figure out what they were going to do with it and how they had to assess, and they couldn't do that. They couldn't even make the first step. Why? Because they were stuck working on other issues instead of this issue. And when they asked us to come in and help them deal with that, I found out that it was just one council member that wanted to deal with it, but the others didn't want to tell them that they shouldn't be, that they didn't want to deal with it. And it was organized garbage pickup, if you know what that is. So they had multiple scavenger companies picking up, refuse companies picking up from on a private contractual basis. It was beating up the streets. It was, it looked bad because there was garbage cans out 5 days a week, and it was a safety issue. But they didn't want to deal with it because they assessed the political risk of doing so great. And so 4 of them didn't want to do it, but they didn't want to tell them. So they had staff kept going back for more information at different times. They were driving staff crazy with getting detailed information on public safety, on public works impact, on the legal issues related to this. They were burning so much time. They didn't want to deal with the issue, but because one council member said we should do it, and the others didn't want to say no, they ended up delaying for over 6 months a critical discussion on the issue. So I just raised that to you. So you need to decide. The second part, go ahead.
Just to go back to John's first comment, I don't think any of us here is omniscient. And you're going to get issues raised up to you by this collaborative group, the whole collaborative group, by citizens, by people at work. They're going to rise up. And you have to recognize them, I guess. Nobody expects you personally to know them all or to be able to figure them all out on your own. It's this group as a body that's going to, especially with the staff, that's going to identify things that we need to deal with.
But you may, any one of you may pick up on an issue. And chances are, if one of you do, others may see it, and you're gonna raise it and say, you know, we should be looking in this issue and then decide whether you wanna do that, and then give Warren some direction on, again, at least assess it. And let me give you an example of where this becomes dysfunctional and you don't think about it, is either you spend time on it, or because you don't wanna bother the rest of staff. You say, Warren, could you look into this for me? And Warren, in many cases, again, 80% of the time, success is in the margin. 80% of the time, it's not going to be a problem at all for him or any staff. But it's that 10 to 20% of the time, all of a sudden, staff's burning a lot of time on that issue, and the rest of you haven't got into it. It's going to be his job, and I haven't talked to him to Warren in advance about this, but it's going to be his job to say, to make a judgment call and say, yeah, this is going to take us too much. And he's going to probably have to tell, he's going to, at one time or another, tell each one of you, yeah, we're not going to be able to look at this in any more detail unless I get consensus from the rest of the council. And then it's going to be up to you to bring it up. And if you got a problem with that, you're going to have to talk to the mayor. And you'll have to have a discussion. But it'll happen. It'll just happen. It's just business. Just recognize that that's going to happen. But if you have the discipline to deal with that, that's going to save a lot of time, and it's going to manage risk for you as well. Because one of you may be raising an issue, and again, chances are the others will have seen it as well. You're going to have to figure out, do you want to tackle that or not? And if not, come up with a valid and appropriate reason to communicate to others why we're not tackling it. People can take no. You've all had to tell people no. They just need a reason. They'd rather be told no than be let on. And I think that's happened. It never happened in Waxhaw, but I think it's happened in other communities where you say, well, we'll dribble in this issue. We'll just kind of, we'll do a little bit with it, but not really solve the problem because we don't want to offend Mary or Joe or Bill or this group or that group. But chances are, you'd be much better off to say, yeah, that is a valid issue. And we can talk about a placeholder place for it, how to where to put those issues. But our priorities right now aren't going to allow us. Maybe in 2 years, maybe in another year, maybe in 6 months, we're going to be able to tackle it. But here's what we're doing now. Here's our priorities, and here's why. Uncomfortable discussion, but much better than leading people on.
So just a follow-up question on that. A lot of times we get issues that pop up at public discussion time, and we allow 20 minutes of public discussion. As a board, we're all trained to just kind of listen and nod, and we don't acknowledge it. But what's an effective way to table that issue and communicate that back?
So, whatever it is, a service issue or anything else, remember, you want to manage time and you also want to look to the public. Depending on exactly how it's brought up, I'll be the mayor. You bring up an issue, tell me what it is.
I like a historic district downtown.
That is, Mr. Prosser, that's an issue that is high, and maybe high on our priority list or not. Let me direct the manager to give you a report on what we're doing on that at a later time, or can you meet with the managers? Or you can say to the manager, can you give us a report in the next weekly bulletin about that issue? So even if it's a service issue, I don't care what it is, don't get sucked into a discussion at that meeting, because you know what? As soon as you begin that dialogue, it's going to burn a lot of time, and you maybe won't have all the information you need, or staff will not be able to get that to you. So we'll talk about this, but
So deflect it.
Get it
as a comeback.
Well, no,
So we
let
can
him do
get
his
it-
job.
Yeah, but we can get it into where it fits into our priority scheme, and we have a chance to influence that.
And
That's all I'm getting at.
And the hard, cold truth is, the reality is, we don't have the staff capacity right now, and it may be something, and I'm not going to say we're going to look at this, but just as an example, it may be something that we look at, but that's not, we have a lot of other priorities. If people, it's like I had a conversation.
That's my point.
I had a conversation with Jim Howell yesterday about code enforcement. I said, Jim, I'm just going to be honest with you. I said, code enforcement is a priority for the town, But until we have a new code enforcement ordinance and a dedicated staff person I said, everybody's going to be disappointed with the results because we are extremely reactive. And I said, we're going to fix it. I said, now we got a lot of other things we got to fix too, because he talked about stormwater and sedimentation and erosion control and a lot of other things. I said, we are going to get to all of those things, but you just have, and he said, you know what, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I think most people, if you just give it to them straight like that, because we don't have the time to tackle. Just like
That's why I brought it up.
And another thing I'm frustrated with is our community engagement, our neighborhood engagement, community engagement process, and the communication element that comes out of the town. And I recognize it's not where it needs to be. And we will get to it, but it's not, I guess these 3, 4, 5 things that we can do. It's like Natalie says, we're going to be a mile wide and an inch deep and not do anything well. Or we can be a quarter mile wide and 10 feet deep and do everything well. But that's where the community patience has to come in, because we can't do everything.
And they'll appreciate it.
I'm sorry, I was just
Paul, you had a
talking.
comment?
I was gonna comment about what do you do when you public comment or something. I was taught you don't say anything, you nod your head and thank the people for coming forward. And then I normally, myself, I get with somebody else that's on the board, like I've got with you at the farmer's market, and I said, yeah, I think we should start looking at that. And you agreed, and I was taught years ago I have a partner in crime. You know what I'm saying?
Blame him.
Well,
You know, so that you could, if he saw the same vision that I did, well, that's okay. But, you know, and then if you have 2 or 3 board members, then
well, yeah, that's perhaps starting to get consensus that has to be discussed as a board. I was kind of getting at more of the issue of how do you some of this stuff is not high priority, but you have to be polite and then deflect and get an answer back to set the expectation properly. Because I think one of the things we haven't done well as a town is set expectations.
You're right.
Saying no.
You're exactly right.
That's what and that's why I brought up historic preservation. It's out there noise-wise.
Yeah, and I have
Yeah.
a question about that since you brought it up.
Thanks,
As far as
Steve.
the process, once that happened years ago, and clearly over a period of a year and a half, it was very clear to the board that was in place at that time that the majority, 92% of the citizens did not want it. When it's appropriate for somebody to stand up and say, we've got to stop this.
That's that assessment. I mean, and again, that's what, that's
That's
really.
a very good point.
And that's the organized garbage pickup. Same thing, you know, somebody wants it, maybe some good reason behind it, but you've also got to look at your risk. What are the risks, political risks of not taking action, but what also are the risks of taking action? What are the risks of time, of staff time?
Well, none of $72,000 was spent,
Yeah,
and nobody was willing to look at.
just say,
And for me, when I'm very strong with this, the people elected us 6 people, but they elected the 5 of us to make the decisions, and working as a group with the town in Warren, that's key to me, because whether they voted for me or not, I'm representing all of them.
absolutely, and that's
But
exactly.
somebody needs to make a decision, and I don't ever want to see something like that happen. That was
And that's what
horrible for our town.
And that's what I'm saying here. You need to be very directive about that. And there are going to be times, as I said, that staff is going to suggest some items, or the public is, or one of you are going to suggest an item, and the answer from the rest of you is going to be no. Well, that's just life. You know, the way the government structure works is there isn't one of you elected to make the decision. There's, as you say, 5 of you and a mayor to make the decision, and you just have to live with that fact. And if they do their job right, and they provide that information clearly about the advantages and disadvantages, they'll live with the outcome. It's up to them to make a compelling case if something's really important. And if you decide not to, that's your choice. And they'll live with it. They're not going to make it more important to them than it is to you. Because that's when things fall apart. That's when they really fall apart. And that's when you end up burning way too much staff time. Because you're going to burn it because you really don't want to make a decision in that area anyway. So that's wasting taxpayers' money.
Right.
that is wasting taxpayers' money. Whether you write a check to a consulting firm or to a contractor, or write a check to your staff for putting their time on an issue, you are wasting taxpayers' dollars.
Are you going to get to the, I guess it's going to be a separate or a defined topic, protocols and business tenant policies? Is that going to come up?
We'll
Is that coming up?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that's the key to assigning staff to doing from this board how that process works, and well-defined, not only for this board, but for the staff also to understand that we all are on the same page.
Yeah, and Warren may be getting into that. What I'm going to talk about next is after you decide that you want to deal with an issue and say it's okay, then they're going to give you a plan for getting you the information that they think you will need to make a decision. All right? Now, again, 80% to 90% of the time, they aren't going to bother putting together a full-time. They're going to provide that information. But there's going to be sometimes that it is a more complex issue. And they're going to say, here's, for a decision regarding infrastructure plan, here's how we plan to get you the information. Here's the information we plan to get you, the cost, where the streets are, how we assess the conditions, different financing options, whatever. They're going to lay out the different elements to what that decision will look like. Keeping in mind that on most of your complex decisions and controversial decisions, you're going to need more than one piece of information given to you the week before. You're going to get it over the course of time. And so they're going to suggest that to you, and you're going to look at it. And it's going to be really important that you look at it and say, we need more information about this, or less information, or just different information altogether. And you've talked about community engagement a couple times. Don't make the mistake of not looking at what you want from the public in terms of feedback. That may add time and complexity onto it and cost, but if you're going to want it, and if you think to manage risk you're going to need it, you're going to have to figure that out ahead of time. Because I saw you, again, and I've seen this in other cities, I saw you when we were given the report on the financial plan, struggling with an issue with some of your planning and not getting enough feedback, right? And so you just have to own up to that decision regarding what information you want. Because remember, the staff time is perhaps the most important financial decision you make, how they spend their time. And if you're not giving them good direction on what you need, they're gonna just be guessing at it. They're going to have to go back and try to recover information that if you would ask for early on, it would have been a lot easier for you to make that decision, a lot easier for them. So it's really important that you buy into that. That doesn't mean that as you get information, you may say, wait a minute, this prompts another question. That's going to happen. But if you do a good job of that, of looking at that ahead of time and agreeing upon it and being critical, and I don't mean negatively critical, just saying, we really are going to need some more information. You're going to get through that decision-making process a lot quicker. And the other thing is you're going to look a lot better to the public. Remember I said managing risk, political risk. You need to be seen with the public as knowing what you're doing, right? And it is great to have disagreements as long as you're respectful about it and you're talking about things in an appropriate way, not throwing each other under the bus or staff under the bus. That never works because the public doesn't take sides when they see controversies like that. They just think you're dysfunctional. Your friends may say, Jim's really, he really gave it to Bill the other night or something like that. But, the general public's just going to think you're dysfunctional. So you've got to make sure you know what you're going to need to make that decision. If something comes up later, you can add it, but generally in the beginning, you got to have a plan for how you're going to get that information.
Yeah, and just tapping into that, the school of government, in the board, the manager, and the board protocols, the school of government, they define what one of the responsibilities of the board is, and it's enhancing the town's public image. And that's what we have to, and one of the things we have to do is manage the public's expectations. Otherwise, we're going to be perpetually failing at what they think we should be doing.
The currency of government, but especially at the local level, the currency of government is public trust. The public, they've got to trust you. And when they trust you, they've got to see you're functioning and using your time and staff time appropriately. They've got to trust you.
Where's the balance of public engagement, though? That was something we heard quite a bit for the past 2 years. We, the past, 2 months, really have not heard as much as we heard in the past 2 years of public engagement, public engagement, public engagement. My thoughts are is for the most part, publicly engaged when they chose these two over the other two, and when they chose him over the other two. That was a big public engagement at that point. They heard what they offered versus what the other two offered and said, this is what we want you to do, to deliver on what you promised us. Therefore, we're going to send you to the seat. So where's the balance of every issue having public engagement versus, no, we put you in the seat, that's our engagement for the most part?
It's a delicate balance, but there's a couple of key features that you need to look at. First of all, you're absolutely right. People elect you because they trust your judgment. It's your job. It's part of your job when you see an issue that to assess what's the potential here for some public pushback on this. Because what you don't want is you really don't want a lot of pushback on an issue at decision time, to be surfaced at decision time for the first time. If you're going to get it out front so that you can demonstrate that here's where we heard all the concerns of the public to be. And it may be just from you talking about people and then repeating it at a session. Here's what we heard, even if you don't agree with it. And you may even include that in your decision-making process. Here's some concerns. Here's what we've heard from the public about these issues. Staff can, to the extent that they are able to, can you provide information on, well, if we do it this way, it's going to cost more later, or there's a better option. You really do have to assess the risk of not responding to that. There are a few issues. Go ahead.
To that point, last week, I met with 5 different people that called me and they had a concern. Those 5 people, I was able to not really push back, but to explain where we were on as far as the commissioner side of it. And then there was another one, the 6th person, and that was something that I couldn't handle, so I turned her over to Warren.
Yeah.
So it is about trust.
Yeah, it is.
It is. These 6 people, they called trusting me because they made me responsible to answer.
And I think the full circle of that, though, is come election time again, I can think of one issue over the past couple of years that the voters then decide or say, yeah, we're not going to do giddy up. We're done with that. Move on. Doesn't matter how much time they said it over and over again, the voters had the ultimate engagement at that point and said, we're not going to do that. We don't want that.
Yeah, and again, you've got to accept that as well. I mean, there are a few issues. In most communities, you shouldn't try to tackle more than 1 or 2 a year at times that require a more extensive public engagement process, more broad-based, community-wide public engagement process. And that's kind of similar to this process here, and we can talk about that separately, but there is a fairly well-established method of getting broad-based public engagement. But it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of energy on your part. It's very necessary because on some things, for example, if you're going to do a referendum to get some, if you're ever going to do a referendum for public improvements, you're going to need to do that. Or I would advise you to do that for a lot of different reasons. It's to manage risk, the risk of not getting approved, but also the risk of getting thrown out of office. And that's a problem. So you're going to want to do that, but you really want to limit it. So there are different ways, but Brenda said it best. I mean, it's your personal deployment. It's how you interact with the public. And I'm going to get at the very end here a way to really cement that. But 80 to 90% of managing the risk of public engagement, of getting the public input and getting it right, can be handled through what you do and how you interact with folks. And it's very important to really pull in especially those people that tend to disagree with you on issues, you really do want to, and if you know that they're going to be concerned about something later on in the process, you need to reach out to them and say, hey, Bob or Mary, we know you have a concern about this type of issue. Tell me now in the beginning what you're worried about, and I'll do my best to make sure that we get those issues addressed as part of our decision-making process. And if you do that earlier as opposed to later, that's going to help us in build trust. Does that make sense? So that's actually, and I'm glad you raised this issue, because that's the toughest part of this, of the information that you need to make decisions. It's defining what you're worried about and also what others are going to worry about that could cause a problem later on in terms of you actually making that decision and implementing it later. Because what I've seen is a big delay in it. You see this a lot. It's probably never happened in Waxhaw, where you do all this work and you're ready to make that final decision and it just gets stalled. Or sometimes you even make the decision, but it never gets implemented because you're worried about the pushback from the public because of the impact of doing that. Well, just deal with that up front. Understand what it is, embrace it, embrace controversy, embrace the fact that, yeah, there's going to be people that are worried about it, and then again, staff can help problem solve that. Does that make sense? This is not the toughest part. I'm going to tell you what the toughest part is. So the first is you got to decide what you're talking about. Two, you got to be affirmative about saying, here's the information we think we'll need. Again, you can adjust that a little bit, but go into it with good faith that you're going to give staff good direction on that so that they can use their time more efficiently. The third part is the discussion phase, and that is once you get all the information in, and this is critical, wait until you not only have all the information in, but that you've also discussed it among yourselves. And then on big decisions, Mayor, if you can, find a way to allow people, the board, to sleep on it before you actually call for a vote. And why is that? It's pretty simple. The separation of those two, that discussion, getting the information first. And if you're absorbing that information and you're really thinking, I don't need to make up my mind yet, you're going to be more open to really absorbing that information appropriately. When I was first manager, one of the many mistakes I made was I would encourage the mayor and others, well, tell me what you want to do here so it'll just be easier for staff if we know what direction you want to go. That was the worst advice I could give them, especially in complex issues, because it didn't allow them to get the information and absorb it. Their job is to give you unvarnished information. They're going to give you that information they ask for. You're going to get sometimes you're going to get information and it's going to show disadvantages and advantages. And you're going to probably get a little frustrated, because I know when I get that from my staff, and I like clear choices. I like easy, I like when they give me stuff that there's all advantages and no disadvantages. Yeah, well, it doesn't happen too often. I don't like when they give me information where there's complexity to it. Well, too bad for me. Their job is to give you that information in a balanced, unvarnished fashion, and then you have to sort through it. And then you have to talk about it and absorb it and kick it around. And then you make up your mind. One of the most effective mayors I ever worked for drove me nuts in the beginning because because he I never knew what he was going to do when making a decision on an issue. And he would wait until we pretty much would follow this process. He'd wait until the very end. And then he'd so eloquently say, and sometimes there'd be a room just packed. And I mean, this is true. There were 150 people in the lobby watching on TV. And there'd be shouting and screaming. And, I mean, it could be pretty nasty at times. But he'd be calm as could be. And he'd say, he'd very patient and go through the information received, kind of the meetings. Here's what I've heard are some of the advantages and disadvantages. I still don't know how he's going to, what's he going to do. And then he'd say, but I'm going to vote this way, and here's why. And it was almost always why. It was almost always just a quick because the advantages slightly outweigh the disadvantages, or the disadvantages of not proceeding outweigh the advantages. So, of not. So he would demonstrate that these are tough decisions, that most of the decisions you make are balanced, feather-weighted in terms of it. And the public loved it. We followed up, in other places I worked, we followed up with doing focus groups with people that were not positively predisposed to saying good things about the city. But I'd have these focus groups because I wanted to hear, this was in Cedar Rapids, and they had a new form of government, it was the largest city, 125,000. And the public loved the fact that there was a very robust debate on issues. But as long as the board members reflected the fact that there were some advantages and disadvantages, they were fine. They may not like the decision, but they weren't strongly opposed. They weren't going to take action. They weren't going to change their votes on who they voted for, most likely. They weren't going to throw the bums out because they didn't like that. They respected those decisions. And so that's the toughest part, just keeping your powder dry till all the information is done, even among yourselves. Don't try to, you can certainly try to get more insights from each other about how you're looking at an issue. But allow the process to work. Just allow it to work. And the public will see that. And it gets back to what Brenda talked about. That's what builds public trust. That's what builds public trust. When they see their thoughts, even use their words. When we use this, we have a public engagement process, and all we try to do is capture the words and phrases that they're using to identify their worries, and then try to provide some information, not try to argue with them, just say, here's some information that responds to the concerns that you have. And allow that to be open book, say, here's what we heard. Actually, I saw a meeting, and I'm trying to remember a specific issue, but Paul, you did that really well. You kind of walk through, here's what I've heard about some of the negatives of doing something, and you spent a little bit of time on that, and I thought that was really masterful, the way you did that. So you're all capable of doing that. You just need to recognize that that's positive. Now, the other thing I'll tell you is, and I should have said this very beginning, never do anything that any consultant tells you to do because they tell you to do it. Do it because it makes sense. So hopefully this makes sense to you. But this is pretty basic stuff. So this is really about roles and responsibilities. Again, you're about the what, staff is about the how. The more time you spend on what gets done, the more results you're going to get. There's a few things in terms of the how. Warren's going to show you the how, especially on issues that may be sensitive. He's going to give you some detail on that, and you're going to let him know if you've got a concern. But for the most part, if you can spend more of your time on the what and less of your time on the how, you'll just get a lot more results. So that's one of the basic systems, the balanced decision process. We've already talked about key financial strategies. Let me stop there. Any observations or concerns, worries from elected officials about this? Anything I'm telling you here give you a heartburn?
Yeah, I equate it, some of you have heard me say it before, it's like making sausage. Oftentimes it's not real pretty what goes into it, but what comes out's not too bad. So the process is not always pretty and as tidy as this makes it out.
It never is, I'll say that.
Because you're never going to have enough information.
So our current process that we employ today is a public hearing we open it, we have the public hearing, and we close it. And then, following your advice, we sleep on it before we make the decision at the next meeting. But sleeping on it, and then if we come with some new vision or new change, the public hearing is already closed. So should we maybe address the process of recessing the public hearing so that when we come back to the next meeting, we pick up the meeting, if there's no new information, then we can't close the public hearing?
No, the public hearing, a couple things on it. First of all, public hearings, if you're waiting to get that vital information for a public hearing, you're dead, right? Not to say you have to do it, but hopefully, again, most of the time all you're hearing is stuff you've heard before. So that's number one. Number two, you do want to close that public hearing. Because the public hearing is just receiving information from the public. You can talk about what you've heard after you close the public hearing. There's nothing wrong with that. You can even bring people back if you want, although I wouldn't recommend it. You can even bring people back if you want, or ask staff to follow up on something that they said to get you more information. You can do that. And there may be very small percentage, and I probably been at thousands of public hearings. There's maybe 1% of the time, 2% of the time, you're going to hear something there that you didn't pick up before that is also may influence what information you want before you make a decision. And then you just have to decide if there's enough support to delay decision until you get that additional information. Nothing wrong with doing that.
So, just follow up with the second point real quick. So then, if we've heard it all before, we're just reinforcing it, then what's the purpose of sleeping on it or the 2 week, the lag time? Why not just go ahead and then have the vote afterwards at that point?
They've got a practice of after the public hearing, they close it, then they come back the next meeting and make a decision on the topic.
Could I interject something?
And which is a little bit unique. Oh, I'm not,
I
haven't
think
seen that before. But
the process we have now is probably the best because maybe we go too far, but it actually gives us some buffer time because you read it in your agenda book, or online, whatever, and you absorb the information. That helps some people absorb the information. Some people do better with a speaker giving out the information. Everybody thinks differently, okay? And then it takes some people, like Fred and I think we're very similar. It takes us a little bit of downtime to absorb it and reconstitute it in our mind for 5 or 6 times before we can actually create that solid bonding of the idea and what we want to accomplish with it. And I think that's why we have the downtime, because if we want to come back, we still can ask questions. We can always call up the person that's there for the public hearing. You can always call that homeowner up or the property owner up. We could always call the staff up and ask them questions. We can also go to town hall and ask the planner some questions about that public hearing, which I think all of us have, because we've always had questions about, and that's assessing, planning, and implementation. It's the same thing. The public hearing is assessing. The planning and implementation is on when you're voting on it. So you have to ask questions so you know what questions you need to overcome that barrier. Does that make sense?
So I think we're mixing and matching processes here. You're talking about a balanced decision process where we're trying to figure out big policies, real estate. We funnel that down into get everything we need, we funnel that into a policy discussion, and then we actually have a decision discussion. What I think you're referring to is more of the legislative process, which hopefully they're coming before us and the policy's already been defined. Otherwise, we're going to send it back to staff and say, we don't have a policy. We're just in violation of policy or whatever, and we got to vote. I think we're mixing and matching here. You're really talking about somebody coming before us for zoning. We have a zoning policy that's already gone through process and policy, and now they're coming to us for a decision, and we're going to have down in the decision discussion, hey, does it conform to policy or not? And we'll take public hearing and we'll go with it. But we're down, my perception is that we're down here, and you're talking about some of these big things that we got to get off our plate. Am I reading that right?
Well, it is. Again, there's no pure
Right.
process here for everything that you do. What you're talking about, John, generally is a quasi-judicial process, and so you've got to follow that. Do I think it's a good idea in that case to wait till the next meeting? That's up to you, but for the reasons that Paul mentioned, there are some practical considerations that say, yeah, there may be some advantages. And from, again, public trust standpoint, what I will also often tell you is if you have, especially an emotional public hearing, and there sometimes are, because it's impacting somebody's personal, somebody's real estate property, and then you take a vote right afterward, it looks like you, again, what you'll hear is, well, you already have your minds made up. So if you can come back and say again, boy, we heard from, and this is maybe what I heard from Paul, here's what we heard from the residents, and you can digest it and say, and reflect what they're saying, but still go ahead and make whatever decision that you said. Now the public is seeing that. Now, the downside of that is, if you're talking about that issue twice, and you're covering the same ground twice, you burn a lot of time. So you should think about how do we manage that time.
Well, and to that point though, just recently we put butts in the seats, many meetings after many meetings, because we never made a decision.
Yeah.
And they kept going, really, we gotta show up again, and again,
It is
and
frustrating.
again, for the citizenry.
Yeah, they don't like coming back.
I'm with you on that,
But that was, we didn't have a policy in place, and so, oops, we had to figure that out and say, oops, Warren, would you go back and figure out, well, we can't change the policy at that point, although it led to a TIA, but could we hire a consultant and get information? So,
Think about those times that you've had, and my guess is this is a lot of the times that you've had a public hearing, and really you get either no information or no substantive information, and saving the ink as well as all the time and being able to make the decision that at that meeting probably makes sense. There are other times when you have highly emotional issues or complex issues, you have the public hearing, and collectively you may decide you want to put that off for another meeting. I still think you'll still get some people aggravated because they'll have to come back again. But, you know, that's your call. That doesn't necessarily tie directly to what I'm saying. I'm directly to what I'm saying. There's more those bigger public policy issues that have political risk to them. Political, and I don't mean partisan risk, but just risk that we're making the right decision for the community. Does that help? So, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not very comfortable at all, 10 being comfortable, I can live and I can use this as a model. I'm just going to ask where you are on this. Fred?
3, 8, 9,
8, 9. Paul?
7, 8.
7.
Frank?
7.
10,
Okay.
7.
Anything that you would want me to talk about to address any of those concerns, or is this just something you want to work with for a while, see how it works? See,
The only question I would have is, before we get to the public hearing, before we get to, how do we approach getting the information we need? There's, I know for myself, maybe for Brenda too, there's been sort of a getting used to how you gather the information you want to make a proper decision. And you know, if you have to make an important decision, I feel you have to be very well informed. What are the bounds?
oh, you shouldn't be too worried about the bounds. The process, however, is talk about it when the issue gets presented to you, and the staff says, here's the information we'll provide. If that opportunity doesn't present itself, and again, they're not going to always know exactly when to provide a more detailed list of what information you want. You just say, I'm going to need more information about this, and you can just mention it at the meeting, or just call the manager and say, you know, and there may be issues on zoning, and you may notice that there's something that a question you always have on it. Just say, can you routinely include this on these types of issues? Some people do that on financial. I had one CPA on a council, and he always wanted to know when we were making some decisions on certain types of infrastructure, what life cycle costs were. Well, you know, not too hard to figure out. Another one wanted information about energy use, you know. So we would just add that to our list. These staff want to keep you happy. There should be no secret about that. They want to make sure you get what you need. You just need to let them know that. and work through Warren, let them know, they'll get you, and if you're not getting that, you let Warren know. If Warren's still not doing it, let the mayor know, and he'll work with Warren, but that shouldn't be a problem. But if you're thinking about it, the others probably are too, so Fred, that's really critical. Your point is very important. And they'll refine it. And that'll change over the course of time. You know, after a while, you may see you're getting information and you just don't need it anymore. Let staff know that as well, because that's just more fodder that, and more time that they've got to spend. But notice, I'm talking about how you invest staff time. And you need to be comfortable. Emotionally, you've got to, when you're making that decision, very few of these important decisions are easy, but you got to think, yeah, I got what I can reasonably get. Another Warren's point is, they're never going to give you information remove all risk from decisions. You'll never get perfect information. There's going to be a balance to get in there, and he'll work on that too.
And the other thing, just organizational capacity to gather this information. I mean, we've got a handful of people oftentimes to pull a lot of information together, and so what we have started doing to some degree is using consultants, which also takes time to manage the consultant. So it's we don't have, we've got a tenth of it. I'm not complaining. That's just the way we are. We've just got a fraction of the folks like the city of Charlotte.
You want this. You're as smart as the elected officials in the city of Charlotte, and you're going to want the same information that they do. Guess how many employees they have? In Cedar Rapids, I had 1,600 employees. I had, just in the manager's office, I had 8 people that could get information. How many did you have in the manager's office get information? Yeah. So it just, so that's just the reality of what you have to deal with. But they'll work it out. They'll find a way. Probably the most important thing is understanding that you're going to have to build up staff, and you're going to have to build up the number of issues you can handle at one time. So anything else about this concern?
I think the thing that's going through my head, Fred, based upon your question is, we're going to have to do a lot more work on the work sessions, because that's where this kicks in versus the regular meeting agenda, which should kind of be, we should get to where it's rote. I mean, to Natalie's point, standards. That's where, and we're going to walk and learn and stumble. And just your comment about just as smart as Charlotte, I am not doing a cheer like Jennifer Wyman's did. Let's just be clear. That was awful.
I guess I'm glad I missed it.
The one question that was raised the last time I did this was, one of the council members said, how do we make this work? Who's really responsible for making this work? Because they thought it was very important. And the answer I gave them was pretty simple. Yeah, it's you. Yeah, it's you. Yep. And I would say, the mayor especially, you've got to be the toughest guys. But it's all of you. He can't make it work. It's all of you guys.
That's basically what I told you before. Everybody in this room is the most important person in here.
Any concerns from staff about what I just said? Because this is about as much about you and about managing your time. And the one thing that usually gets staff a little nervous is that unvarnished information. So you're going to have to prepare information at times, which will make these guys uncomfortable, because it's going to show some of the problems with decisions. Just keep in mind, very few of the decisions you make, important decisions, are going to be all advantage. In fact, there's going to be none that have clear advantages and very few disadvantages. They're all featherweight. And that's why split votes, that's just live with it. It's going to happen. You're going to have different opinions. You don't all have the same mindset, the same lens on the world. Live with it. And just recognize that we got to move on.
It's real important to me when something comes before me, and I think that's what we're kind of talking about is the facts and gathering as many facts as you can about a situation. And I know you know, you can't help, emotional is involuntary. You hear something and we all think differently emotionally about a certain subject, but that fact-based decision is what I try to hone in on.
That's
Yes, what are
important.
the facts?
Yeah. So what's really helpful is a lot of times, and again, you can help with this as elected officials, when people worry about something, they often express it emotionally. But then getting behind what's behind that emotion, because there's usually something that will get you a fact. I'm worried that my property values will be decreased. Well, why are you worried about that? What makes you worried? And you just keep asking that why so you can get it. All right. Any staff, anything? So that, I think, is the building block of everything. And with the limited time, I'll just mention some of these other systems. So another one is that key financial strategies, and you've had that, but you need to use that. It was earlier, I think, John, you mentioned, and the mayor mentioned, you're going to have some items come up from time to time that, and Natalie referred to this as well, that you're maybe just not ready to deal with now, but you need to keep it in the list. You can also show the public that you're respecting their concerns, but you put that in the key financial strategies, and you may put it just on a, it's even out of the scope of the 10-year plan, but you may say, you may just start a list of, here's some other considerations. Once we get all this stuff done, we're going to look at this. And you just put it in there, because that's a legacy document. This is a legacy practice. Balanced decision process is a legacy practice. You do that regularly, you're going to change the culture of how you get things done. You'll get things done better, faster, and cheaper if you do that. This is a legacy document that if you update that on an annual basis, and it does take some staff time to do that, but the more you do that, the less time you'll spend on the budget, and the less time you'll spend talking about the financial implications of other issues. So you do that, and then as new elected officials get on board, your new finance director will walk them through that, or Warren will walk them through, here's what it is. And actually, having shown that to the public is usually very helpful as well. By the way, showing that to rating agencies and to the LGC will be important. So that'll give you a place to put a lot of these issues, and it'll also allow staff to work. The financial plan is something that they should be looking at on a regular basis, and they can be using that as their document to really frame up financial issues. So remember, in that financial plan, you have things like the pavement management system, you'll have IT, you'll have even issues related to a master park plan. You'll be able to find a place for that in a context for it. So that's an important system to get in place. The communities that use this successfully find that in their third or fourth year, it really begins to show the value of your budget. The time you spend on budget gets significantly reduced because you will have had the context. Because most of the time you're spending on budgets right now, you're not talking about the issues of importance. You're just talking about what has to get cut, right? What has to get cut. You're not talking about what you need to grow. What has to get cut, and that's just not a good discussion. That's living paycheck to paycheck. So you got to do that. A communications plan, and this is really something important. There's two elements to a communications plan that you need to think about, and that is, and Brenda, you hit on this actually all of the time at that point in time. You're hearing stuff from the community. You're hearing, and you want to also be able to. You also want to be able to get ahead of issues. So if you know a street's going to get torn up and you're going to get a lot of complaints on it, they need to let you know that. So they're going to let you know that, and maybe you do this already in some regular communications. But they need to know what are those topics where you get your ear chewed off, and you're going to want to know ahead of time on those issues. And you're not going to think of all of those right now, and I'm not suggesting you do, but over the course of time, you're going to feed that information to Warren, and he's going to build up an understanding of the type of information you want. In one community that we worked with recently, there was concern that there was infrequently, and it was very infrequently, there were police incidents where the state police was pursuing somebody, and the city or the town would get involved, and they'd get a lot of calls because it was just the type of community where that, and they want to know about that. Well, the chief can't give, in most cases, a lot of detail, but they can pretty rapidly, if it's an event like that, they can probably provide information and say, yeah, there was an incident that occurred on the interstate, and our officers assisted in pursuit, and whatever publicly they can release, they'll let you know about. That actually helps you if you get ahead of it. It helps him so that you're dealing with those issues. Just understand that there's some issues that and information he's not going to release, and he won't give it to you. Just understand that. But just keep in mind, what are the types of information you need? Water's going to get shut off in a certain part of town because you're going to need to do a water main replacement or repair. You're going to want to know about that so that if you get some calls, that you'll have that information ahead of time to the extent that they can provide that to you. So think about what you get calls about, what you want to know. What I'm also suggesting you do here is avoiding doing total information dump, because there's so much going on here. If you ask for everything, staff will spend forever putting together that information. But if you say, here's the general topic areas, and my suggestion is if ones are not already doing this, he'll give you some target areas, and you'll say yes or no, that'll work. Same thing with progress on projects. You don't want to spend a lot of time at meetings going over that in detail. So they can provide some summary reports on some of the top projects that you're working on, but very high level. And if you have some questions or concern on that high level, you send an email or tie a note through on a rock and throw it through Warren's window, but somehow get the information and he'll follow up. But provide information on projects, or if they're getting a bunch of complaints about leaves in the streets or about whatever it may be. If they're getting a bunch of complaints, they're going to pick up a trend. They're going to let you know that because they'll know you'll get a bunch of calls about that. So a communications plan, what I'm telling you, needs to be tailored about from what you're hearing. Don't expect comprehensive information on every last thing, because, again, that was one of the many, many mistakes I make, is we had staff prepare all that because I wanted to be responsive. And I found out later, and the council said, oh yeah, we're going to need all that information. Well, they weren't reading it because it was 4 pages of information. They didn't have time to read it. So they weren't reading it. I was wasting staff time, and the council wasn't looking at it. So we just started to ask, okay, look at this list. What do you really find of importance to you? Does that make sense?
And just full disclosure, Kathy has taken the manager's communication, done a great job with it, but I realized that needs to improve even beyond. And so that kind of feedback on what you're actually looking for. Communication is not, I'm great at sitting down and having the one-on-one conversation, but when it comes to really effectively communicating through a document like that, I've got work I've got to do.
Right, and don't try to get perfect. That's just a waste of time. Try to get better. Don't try to get perfect, because you'll never get it perfect.
Are you still getting the summary from staff of everything going on out on Facebook? My point is, that summary probably is the synopsis of a whole hell of a lot of garbage going on.
Who knows the answer to?
Well, obviously, you're not reading it.
Free speech.
But I mean, in terms of what I'm getting at is, instead, that's a summary of the issues out there. I mean, Lisa used to do that. Here's the noise level.
Yeah.
The story, this, next door Prescott,
She does that, and it's just a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
That gets fed over
So
time.
they're gonna.
So you're aware of,
Oh yeah,
the noise, that's what I'm
That's
getting
She'll
another
send a
one.
heads up
I'm not a
email.
big Facebooker, and I struggle with that whole social media.
And it's probably good that you're not. The staff here.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
departments will know what they're getting calls about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
What they're gonna do,
Yeah, we let him know.
Yeah,
and if they get a bunch of calls that they think you need to know about sooner than the normal communication, then then you'll figure out a way. Do you all have your email? So they'll send you an email. Now, here's again, I had the same problem with Central Line. We wanted to keep our board informed, but they just said after a while, well, you're sending us too many emails. So, just send them once a week unless there's really some emergency. So we changed on that. And that's going to be an adjustment.
I don't know if this is yet a question or a comment, but what I'm hearing in terms of kind of what may be getting communicated over Facebook or what's happening in terms of kind of community dialogue, I could see that being very different information from what staff is likely to provide a board in terms of communication around goals or strategic initiatives.
Oh, absolutely.
But the key point I think I'm trying to make here is that there could be a lot of dialogue occurring in the community that is not at all aligned with wherever the board goals are, which is ultimately what Warren has been directed to implement and is coming down to staff. And so if there is an expectation in whatever's happening in the community dialogue that staff somehow starts to try to mitigate for it, I'm just saying that has the potential to get us away from the goals if those two communication streams are very different topically.
I was just more asking the question, staff is already on top of grabbing the issues out and taking the emotion out and just saying, hey, Warren, we've had 50 comments on this, probably gonna bubble up or you're gonna get a phone call. That's all.
Yeah,
At least it's doing that. That's what I'm getting at.
But as far as everybody making a comment,
Yeah, yeah.
I guess, does that ever turn into what are we doing about it? Because if it turns into what are we doing about it, at least the way I understand kind of the goals, priorities, mission, vision, that is a shift in direction on what goals are now trying to be accomplished.
You could be deploying staff resources inappropriately to
Yes.
respond.
Yeah.
If you're
And you're right,
Yeah.
Dennis, just reading, most of the people, and I'm not being derogatory or pointing any fingers, but a lot of the people are the same people that post in derogatory manners against the town. And clearly, when you read through, if you are engaged just a little bit, they don't know what they're talking about. So it's not going to lead to a decision. That's just my point of view.
I like my morning dose getting called a moron. I like my morning dose getting called a moron. It happens quite frequently. Usually not me, it's collective us.
I've never said it publicly.
Well, most,
Thank you. Thank you, Chief.
But only if you go back.
the way I read Facebook is
Yeah.
they're under a veil, a shroud, and all the information they have is unsubstantiated. It's not all really true. Not everything you read in Facebook is true. Believe it or not, just like the newspaper.
Sure. Yeah, you can,
Most of
the
the
point
time
is
it's not true.
you can distract a lot of appropriate attention from more appropriate issues if you rely on social media as a source for that. So just be careful on social media. The other part of the communication plan, and the broader one that's really critical, is with the public. And part of what I'm saying is getting staff information about topics, issues, concerns, what you're hearing in the community, getting that back to your staff, letting Warren problem solve with his staff about whether they need to take action on it or not is really important. If you disagree with that, in terms of how they respond from time to time, that's okay. Just let him know. He's not going to get it right 100% of the time.
And the one thing on the communications plan, and I don't think we do a good job of communicating, Waxhaw has a tremendously positive story to tell. I mean, we're going to focus on some of the things we need to fix today and tomorrow, but our story is extremely unique to what's going on in the country. I mean, the last week, I got, Don Fisher sent the email about Waxhaw being the #1 place for young families in North Carolina. And there was another one that came out a couple of days ago about Waxhaw being in the top 3 or something for safe communities in North Carolina. And I don't think we do a good job of getting that type of thing out there, because that just builds a tremendous amount of community pride
And momentum.
and momentum, absolutely.
Because, again, what that's going to help do is going to help communicate the value of government when that happens, because that's an external validation, and that's going to help you when you need to make investments in the community.
And along with that, the next part of the communication needs to be, we can't rest on our laurels. I mean, this is happening to some degree in spite of ourselves. Just to be quite honest, I mean, there are some things we haven't done yet. We continue. Imagine what we could be. And Waxhaw's a great place. I mean, I plan on being here as long as I can be here. But imagine what kind of community it could be with some additional investments beyond what we've even done. It could be. The mayor talked about a world-class community. That is absolutely the trajectory we could be on with the right type of strategy in place.
Yeah, and in that vein, I mean, we have invested in looking at our brand. That's going to come back to us, I think, in the March timeframe, but how to convey a story and whether the appropriate vehicles are things that are getting looked at so we can start to do that as this stuff comes live. And that's good stuff.
One of the other recommendations that we would have is that you actually, and again, this is not something you want to do this year, but you want to begin to put together a communications plan that you all look at. And there's 3 critical elements of that. First of all, realize that there's no one way, there's no one mechanism that you will use to communicate effectively with the whole public, or even one message. So you're going to need to gradually build it. Start with everything at once. But over the course of time, look at what you're currently doing. And also look at what you're currently doing. What can you stop and do different and do something differently? So in most cases, the communication plan includes some type of newsletter, some type of website presence, sometimes some type of social media, some type of annual event where you communicate and engage the public. You may be doing this already with, I don't know, National Night Out. That's really an opportunity. We encourage communities to think about an open house periodically. Your survey is a communication. You think of communication as telling people. Really, it's much more powerful to hear back from the people. And doing that about once every 2 to 3 years, I think that's even in your financial strategies. And using that as a way to get some information from them, but also then feeding that back. Here's what we've heard, and here's the areas that we've improved on. Here's what we can work on more, and letting them know that you've heard from them and what you're doing with that information is really very, very critical. I mentioned earlier about an open house, having an opportunity for the public to meet your staff. And we've done this, we did this recently in Lincolnton, and that was used as part of their strategic planning, but it was pretty much just an open house where the department said, here's what we're doing, here's some things we've accomplished, here's some things we're planning to do in the future, and the public loved it, because they got to, the public really does like their staff too, and the more they can see them one-on-one and see their dedication and interest and professionalism.
I guess my question to that would be, and I've had this discussion with the mayor, if we do that, if we were to do that, let's say next Wednesday, we're going to have this, we'll feed the same folks we've fed the past 3 times we've done that. We'll not call names, but hi Earl, hi Terry, it's the same people. We're not going to get, we're not going to get the same, it just seems like to me that the folks are not going to show up in droves other than the folks that we get and we feed. I don't mind feeding Earl a good meal every now and then yet. But
Same thing with the pizza party kickoff. It was the exact same people. There may have been 3 different people that I haven't seen at our board meetings. for.
Right.
Other than that, it was all the same people.
And I guess.
And the harsh reality of what has come back in the branding work that she's done survey, you don't have a purpose for why you're communicating. So it is a self-motivation. I mean, we want to communicate. Bah humbug so the Earls come because he needs another slice of pepperoni. Don Fisher comes, the same old people come because they're used to doing it.
Not old, don't call them.
Huh?
Earl doesn't like old. Don't call him
So
old.
but the point is
Well, he better get used to it.
and again,
Get older.
Can we just go on record and say we love Earl and Donald?
Hi, old Earl.
the solution is with you, though. Yeah, in any efforts to get public engagement, it's the elected officials who have to reach out to the people.
Yeah.
Especially in what you want to go to those people who tend to be more critical of what you do, and you want to encourage them to show up, but you want to encourage others to show up as well. But I am not suggesting you put a lot of time or effort into this, but periodically you want to at least offer that opportunity.
But are we missing a message that the folks are satisfied? That they don't feel the need to engage? Help me on that.
No, but yeah, well, what I was going to get to is here's a point for a policy level decision for the board. That's right along the lines with what you're saying. We did the town manager survey a couple of years ago, and it came out, it talked about what the community, it was 240 some odd people that participated. Is that something that and it needs to be fine-tuned for this purpose, but every couple of years, a matter of policy, should the board say, okay, we're going to commission another survey to get the temperature of the community, what's going on out there, what do you like, what do you want to see that you're not seeing, and get the feedback, and it gets into the whole assessment, the assessment side of the house. These are the things that the community thinks we need to be working on. These are the community's priorities, and use that as a tool. And every couple of years, as a matter of practice, going out and doing that.
And I guess, though, to that question, though, is Jim said earlier, to me, again, back to those 3 or 4 previous meetings where we packed the house, it was a issue or specific issue-driven thing, and it wasn't a positive issue in their mind. If we come up with a positive issue, we don't have anybody in the house. It's an empty place, and we move forward. But when we're gonna possibly put a gas station in their front yard, they turn out and drug it.
And that's the nature of the deal.
So the lesson I learned from the town manager survey, having a professional define it, because Robert Burke's company, whatever the heck name of it, they designed it, and we had a 2-week window, and we hit 250 people. So, and very specific, but I think what you're talking about, not only tweak, but a refined, continual engagement in that manner with the citizens every 2 years. If you look at the successful town, what they claim they're successful towns around North Carolina, Cary, Chapel Hill, you go through the list. Hickory, I think, did.
We did.
They go through this with an outsider, and the citizens know they're going to get a chance to talk about everything about the town, not an issue. We have been issue-driven, so tired, let's have a conversation. That statement has been, we're going to have a conversation week after week after. Well, they're tired, we're not having a conversation, we're talking and you're not listening.
But to your point, though, so 15,000 people, 250 people, 2%.
But that's statistically valid. I mean,
2%?
Yeah.
Yes.
It was a random sample.
Yeah.
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 So, yeah, if they did a random sample,
It was 12,000.
if they did a random sample,
Perhaps.
if there was a random sample, and we can talk about that. Again, Warren's asking a good question. You want to do that, we recommend that you do that. How you do it to make sure you get statistically relevant, and also how do you build that survey?
Right.
Is really key, because you really do want to build a historic document that can show trends. And so, and about every 2 to 3 years is probably about right.
And so that's a question to the board. And I'm not saying develop the survey today, but as a matter of practice, policy of the board, is that something that you want to do every couple of years?
And my answer to that would be yes, probably, but
Okay.
after we get the other stuff sorted out.
Okay.
After we get the house in order,
Yeah.
and then go ask.
Well, this
everybody's
is on the scale of things, this is actually an easy one. Because you're hiring a consultant and you're working with them and developing the survey, but then they're doing all the work and bringing the results back. And it's part of the whole community assessment, broad community assessment that Jim was talking about.
And it communicates value too.
Mine is yes, but it would have to be an off election year, because you have a new board coming in every 2 years, basically, we make it a new role. So it takes them, not anything with you guys, I mean, it takes you about 6 months to get back to the speed that we already had entrenched. And it's not your fault, it's just that we had all this information for 2 years, and we absorbed it, and we actually absorbed more information faster because we had that training. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That all depends on who the person is and if they've been involved with the process for 10 years. So, you know, I can sit here and say I have pretty much the same information because I've been there.
Not all the same.
A lot of
I
communities,
get it.
a lot of communities want to not have the survey in the same year that they have the election. That's all.
That'd be the coming year.
Yeah.
So the question you're asking is, do you have consensus around, do you want a consistent community feedback mechanism? If yes, let the staff come back over time with how that might work, off election, types of questions, do you want to get to a specific issue?
You're not a-
But the fundamental policy, is that something that we tend to think would be useful for us?
Yeah. I think honestly, 2 years, no less than that, but 3 years would be fine. 4 is probably pushing.
And I do like the off-election year. I mean, I think that makes sense. That way you're not,
Plus, we're changing a
Brenda,
little bit of direction every 2 years.
2 years is fine.
Go ahead.
Paul?
Yeah.
I could, yes, the answer is yes, but I could see the value of having a survey right now to establish a baseline and then see how much we've accomplished in 2 years.
So some thoughts, so you can work on that. And that gets back to, that's part of communication. That's really part of public engagement.
Where's that person putting the ticky mark up there for a to-do for?
Yeah. So there's
Now,
our
come on now.
first, yeah, I'm gonna put my communications director right on that, so.
Just sit on this job.
No, but that's good. That's, I think there'd be a lot of value for everybody.
I was only kidding you.
So the
I like
other,
down my job here, man.
the
Back there
other,
listening.
the other systems were land use plan and ordinance. And you're working on that, I understand. That's a critical foundation piece. And part of that gets back to that, a lot of that gets back to your mission and vision, making sure that you're addressing that. But it's also part of your finance, because again, you got to look at that cost to serve model. Is what it's getting built here, or is it covering its costs?
Second question for you though. We have a document that's been produced. What's the system part of it that you're talking about specifically around land use?
Well, the system is with the right type of land use plan. I mean, again, what happens in many communities, and I don't know that it's happening here, is that you end up spending a lot of time either providing variances or arguing about stuff that already, is permitted or not permitted, and finding ways around that. And that ends up burning too much of your time. So part of it is just time management. The other part of it is from an economic development standpoint, making sure that, because again, one of the strategies is in most communities, you are very, very heavily leveraged with residential development. And there's a great risk with that. And the great risk is, number one, any changes in law that would impact the revenue generation off of residential, and this happens periodically in states, is that you're in great jeopardy of potential negative impact to your revenues. Another part of that is just what is our cost to serve? Generally speaking, residential covers less of its cost to serve than any other type of development. And so you just have to factor that. So having, without question, heavily residential communities tend to have a higher tax burden for the same level of services. So those are the systems issues. So it's time management, it's also community conflict issues. It's, you really got to really do a good job with your land use plan, you just need to ask yourselves, what are the problems we're experiencing now that really go back to the existing plan that's in place?
And they're extensive. I mean, one of the reasons that we don't have a diversified tax base is the land use plan.
Well, and enough space, I mean, and having open space, and, I mean, there's all sorts of things that that come into play with that. And I talk about land use plan in a very general sense. You know, some of that is codified into your comprehensive land use plan, and that's adopted. Some of it's your ordinances. But you're just starting off with some with your vision statement, and then that gets put into these plans. But you got to start off with what's working now in terms of how the town is set up. What's working now? What are the problems? I mean, that ties to your transportation. Somebody else mentioned, you mentioned that the concern was about traffic and traffic congestion. Well, that has a lot to do with land use. You know, where do we have existing uses that generate a lot of that traffic? What can we do to address that? So you know, that's all important. So identifying problems and looking at those problems that tie into our land use plan. What can we do to address that in a more systematic way as opposed to one at a time? Because these onesies and twosies are going to kill you. Yeah. And that's what a lot of times you provide variances and you do workarounds because the ordinance is not functioning properly. This is critical. Getting your land use plan right, or at least moving in that direction, is really critical. And from what I've seen here, this is causing a lot of that potential conflict and controversy and expense.
Certainly time.
Yeah, well, certainly time. And that gets back to your transportation plan, ties into that. You know, we're beginning to see, well, as part of the work we did across the region, the 8,500 people that interacted with us, and obviously those were people more predisposed to being involved and being future-looking, but that we had very strong support across the board for more transit-oriented development and supporting public transit systems. I'm not saying that's true in Waxhaw, but the reality is that we're going to see changes in how people look at transit. The newer generations are looking at development and transit very differently. The idea that we're going to build communities around single vehicle, occupancy vehicle transportation, that's changing. And what are you doing to adapt to that, if that's true here? It may not be true here, I can't tell you it is, but you at least need to have that discussion.
Just to touch on that also, your aging population is also going to be more dependent on transit and transit-oriented development. So I know your population is aging, it is throughout the nation, so making sure that we're serving both the millennials and the boomers.
Yeah, Jim, just and to kind of connect the dots, at least for me, on the being heavily, slanted or leveraged on the residential side. I understand kind of where our predominant age group is in terms of demographics here in Waxhaw, and that's kind of that late 30s crowd. But if you look at some other statistics, you'll see that we have a significant amount of baby boomers, and I think that over time, and their needs around housing will change. And right now I see a predominant housing type where it's single family residential detached housing and multi-level primarily with a lot of the newer communities. And so over time, as people age in place, that tends to not be the type of house that they can age in place very well, because steps, things of that nature. And so, you know, my hope is that we have another group of people who can easily start to replace those houses that get vacated for other types of housing options that, quite frankly, we're struggling to get to.
The second city that I managed was Richfield, Minnesota, 35,000 population, immediately adjacent to Minneapolis. Almost all of the housing there was built post-World War II, between 46 and 60. I got there in 86, and the big problem we were having was essentially market obsolete housing, so we were fully built out, and the housing was overall in good shape, but we were getting bypassed from new home buyers because they were looking for the new stuff, and we had pretty much all of one type, and that was negatively impacting us. That's one of the problems we have with smaller communities. We were 7 square miles, and they're just one. So we have to look at how do we diversify our housing type to make sure that we were having really a broader representation of age groups within the community. Again, you need to look at what's happening demographically.
This is the story.
I'm sorry.
Jim? Oh, I'm sorry.
Transportation plans also looks at more walkable neighborhoods. We think about transportation as cars, buses. Walkable is getting to be very, very important for people. If you look even from an economic development standpoint, if you look at, there was a national study done, and it looked at where a lot of the newer development, economic development, and if you just looked at 3 factors, one of them was walkable communities. Trying to think of the other 2, walkable, access to public transit.
Greenways is also huge.
Yeah, but they were all transportation. They're all related to that. Having really paying attention to your downtown is going to come into play as well. Accessible to services. I think that was the third. So that transportation plan is going to be one of those systems that you staff training and recruitment. Just making sure, and I think you're doing a good job of looking at that, but making sure your pay is competitive, making sure your working conditions are. And the other, this culture that you properly identify, changing your culture is really critical. Staff will want to go to organizations that get things done. And especially as you attract that talented staff that is ambitious, they want to work where they can get things done that are priorities to you. And I've heard it already just at break time, how excited the staff is to see that you're working as a team. As Paul said, you're all one team. Nobody's more important. I've said that myself. We just play different roles. Nobody's more important. Because every role here is critical to getting the job done. And so they're going to want to see that. That's really critical. That understanding it and embracing that is really important. Strategic plan, and you're clearly nailing that, but making sure that stays a focus throughout the entire year. Making sure that you're going through that feedback loop. Is this still the right vision and mission? Is this still, are these still the goals that will achieve? And knowing that that's going to change during the year. If occasionally you don't drop a goal or modify that goal, that would be very weird. You're going to do that. Certainly you're going to change the strategies because you're going to find that your initial thought on the strategy was not the right one, or you don't have the right resources. That's an okay thing to do. In fact, it's bad not to make adjustments because you just wasted staff time and elapsed time because you weren't able to move in that direction. And then communicating that to the public so that they see that. And the mayor pointed out very well where outside investors will see that as well. They got to know that you got your act together, that you know what you want to be, and that you're taking the right steps to get there. Finally, that public engagement plan, and we talked a little bit about that, but really having an idea of when we're going to engage the public on those important issues, what's the process? And so we can, as I mentioned, we can talk in greater detail, but you do need to have that in place. And it has to address what John talked about, is how do we get people out that don't traditionally come out to us? You've got to actually develop this expectation for how you do that, so you do get people out and they understand the importance of doing it. Because if you don't do that, if you don't build a culture within your community that people show up and participate and give you feedback, then you're just increased the risk that you have on other issues. And if you do require the public to make investment decisions, referendums, or even just general election votes, the lack of a culture which really demonstrates that the connection between what the people say and what the people say and what they're worried about, how it informs your decisions, that's what you want to accomplish. It's not that the public's telling you what to do, or you're looking for how many, sticking your finger in the air to see which way the wind blows. That's not it. It is about making sure that the public sees that their concerns are being addressed in one fashion or another. And as long as you do that, whether they agree with you or not in their final decision, you can probably get past that. It's whether they know that your decisions are being informed by what they're worried about or concerned about. What I really recommend in this area, this public engagement, and my guess is you're doing this informally already, but each of you as a council member, as an elected official, really should think about what can I do to meet with a group of people at least 4 times a year. And it may be a coffee club group, it may be an ETAG group, folks. It should be people that you, like a kitchen cabinet to you, that you just check in when you ask them. And it should hopefully include some people that may have been critical of you in the past. But you ask them to sit down and you just ask them. We used to do this again in other communities I worked in. What do you see that's happening in the town now that's working well that can be improved? And you don't have to provide a lot of answers. The purpose is just to give them, and you tell them that the purpose is you just need to hear from them and want to use them as a sounding board and just get some input. But that goes a long way. And if each of you are doing that, that's going to help your staff a lot too. Because that group will tend to talk to others and let them know that you do this. And that's very important. Because in the end, remember what I said is the currency of local government is public trust. And you really develop that public trust by listening to what the people have to say and then using their words to frame up how you look at issues. If they see that, that's going to make a big difference.
I think the other part that we have to get comfortable with on the seeing us is that people are shifting, and you brought this up to me, to watching the electronic version and offering comments back. And that's not a bad thing.
No.
We just have to figure out how we share that as a group and talk about it. But that's a good thing. There's a couple of people that I know, that's all they do is they watch these things electronically because that's how they want to digest it, and they share stuff back. Hey, I don't like your tie, or whatever. But seriously, I mean, that's a new way, but an effective way of engaging.
And again, what's real powerful is not that you agree with what everybody says, but rather that you reflect that you've heard it. The final step here is, and I'm not going to go through the detail, but if you take a look at these systems, you've identified these are the challenges and these are the opportunities. These systems will help you address this. If you don't use these systems or find another system, because I'm not saying these are the perfect systems, you may find other systems, it really doesn't matter. But you've got to find systems that tie into these. If you don't, you're one and done. And if you're one and done when you do things, if you're just doing it one time, you don't develop any muscle memory, so you're not going to have sustaining results. You know, that's the problem with fixing a street one time out of the context of a pavement management system. You know, fixes that street, but it doesn't address the overall systematic type of issues you may have in the community. You know, it's starting a recreation program without figuring out really what's the context of that recreation program or initiative. It's preparing a plan, you know, for downtown redevelopment without figuring out where does it really fit in here. You know, because I will tell you, those plans won't get implemented in most cases if you don't have this type of system discipline. They typically don't get implemented, and so you just flush money down the toilet. There's very little value in a plan that doesn't get implemented. There is some, but very little. So you just keep that in mind. Everything, when you leave here today, what I'd encourage you to think about is, how does this fit into the systems that we need to develop? And then the focus should be on your goals. Whatever goals you end up with, hopefully there's a system to support it, and you probably haven't fully developed each one of these systems. That's okay. But you want to think the next part for those goals are, what are we doing to build the systems to help us sustain these results over the long time so that we can get some momentum.
Any advice based upon your experiences? Where do you see boards, councils stumble as they're working through a system or a multitude of systems?
It's trying to get too much done at once.
Trying to get
there's a paradox here, and that is the best councils around, the best elected groups around are ambitious. You want them to be ambitious, but that ambition is also a disadvantage, because if you're so ambitious that you don't become disciplined about what you do, then you're going to have a lot of activity with no real results. There's going to be, and that'll show after a period of time. It's good intent, but good intent doesn't get you results.
That's a mile wide and an inch deep.
Yeah, that's the mile wide and an inch deep. It is really, and you have to be tough about with each other, but also with the public. There's going to be some frustration, and learn to live with frustration. You got to decide what frustration do you want to live with. You want to live with the frustration that you're not getting anything done, or you want to live with the frustration that you can't get everything done at once. Right? Just think about that, because if you can live with the fact that we can't get everything done at once, that's a frustration that I think you can sleep at night with. As long as you're figuring out collectively what's the most important thing we want to get done. What are those 1, 2 things that are really important, priorities that we really want to get done, that are important to us collectively? May not be important to you individually, but as a whole, as a board, are important. And the other fact is getting results is really addictive. And you'll see that. I mean, once you can get some results in some of these areas, and maybe something that the public doesn't fully appreciate, but it builds that foundation. Again, what we've seen, and it really doesn't matter too much where you start, as long as you decide where you start. But you've got a lot of this already underway. The key financial strategies, I think, was very important. The balanced decision process, in terms of implementing in its raw form, it's not that hard to do. It's really hard to get it as a discipline and just get it into muscle memory. But once you can do that, that gives you a lot of leverage. That moves things along. Because keep in mind that managing time and risk. If you can always think about, okay, how does this help us manage time and risk? What are those important steps? Other questions, comments? Did I miss one?
No, I was just saying it's noon, and I know you have another appointment, I think you have.
Yeah, there's good times. Well, don't hesitate to call me at any point in time. I think you should be very, very proud. Again, I've been at hundreds of strategic sessions. It's rare where you see the alignment on the elected board that I see here. A lot of alignment. That doesn't mean you all see things exactly the same way, but you all realize what's fundamentally important in terms of moving ahead. And you also are a very dedicated staff that's very interested in the fact that they see this as a positive move in terms of the alignment that you have is going to give you a lot of traction, a lot of speed in terms of moving things along. Just temper your expectations, build the foundations, and then move. So thanks. Thank you. The last thing I want to do is just quickly, again, on that scale of 1 to 10, 1 being helpful or not very helpful. So not very helpful is 1, 10 being very helpful. How did this go for you today? And I'll start this time with Jim.
9.
9. Thank you.
9.
10.
Thank you.
9.
I give you 10.
Good.
I told him if he didn't average a 10, he wasn't getting paid, so.
You got 9.4.
Thank you so much. Just getting to your point, Waxhaw is seen as a leader. You've picked a manager that is seen a leader not only within this area, but within the state. And so I think you're well suited to move ahead, and we're pleased to work with you because your success is important for the region as a whole. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Lunch?
Yeah, I'll see the lunch is sitting on the table.
It's lunchtime.
Start back.
Here's lunch, there's forks in the boxes, and there's a variety. The bags are empty, but they identify the paid salad or fruit.